SEP Fanfic Readings presents What the Room Requires by Alydia Rackham. Chapter 14. Draco. Once upon a time... Really? What? I sat up and put my hand on my hammering heart. Her squeal had scared me to death. Hermione pushed the few barley stalks between us out of the way, then mashed them down and found my eyes. You really start a story with once upon a time? I gave her a weird look. Yes? She gazed at me for a moment, then smiled and lay back down on her back. I narrowed my eyes at her. What? Nothing. She kept smiling softly at the clear blue sky. Muggles just start their stories that way, too. Ugh, good to know, I muttered, turning back to my staring up at the puffy clouds and trying to calm my heartbeat. The wind rustled all around us, though only a few stalks stood between me and Hermione as we lay on our backs in the middle of the field. I cleared my throat. Anyway, once upon a time, in a faraway land, there lived a very rich warlock who had a lot of friends and a lot of parties. He was quite content until all of his friends began falling in love and becoming completely impossible. What do you mean, impossible? Hermione cut in. Impossible, intolerable, irritating, I said. Ah, she said, only I words. Exactly. Anyway, I began again. He realized that everybody around him who fell in love started acting like an idiot and making a fool of himself, so the warlock decided he'd outsmart love and use dark magic to do so. Uh-oh, Hermione muttered. This won't end well. Yes, well, stop guessing about things, I scolded. You'll get ahead of me. So it does end badly. I'm telling the story. Fine. So, I huffed. All of his friends married and began having dozens of children that got underfoot, and the rich warlock just smirked at himself, because he was sure he was smarter than all of them. But then, several years later, he overheard some of his servants talking about him, and they said some things he hadn't expected. One of them felt sorry for the warlock, and the other one made fun of him, wondering why a wealthy man like him couldn't even find a wife. So the warlock decided that moment that he would marry the richest, most beautiful woman in all the world. Luckily for him, just such a lady came visiting from a neighboring kingdom the very next day. That's convenient, Hermione declared. I glanced over to see her making a cynical face up at the sky. I smiled crookedly. The warlock just started courting her, and everyone was surprised he'd finally fallen in love. But he didn't feel a thing for her. Nothing, because of the spells he had cast. He just pretended. Finally, at a dinner at his home, he asked the lady to marry him. She said she would, if she could be sure he had a heart. For, you see, even though he was fooling everybody else, he wasn't fooling her. So the warlock told her he had something to show her, and took her down to the secret chamber beneath the castle. And there, in a case in the center of his room, was his heart. His heart? Hermione gasped. What? It's not possible. So? I flung out my hands. It's a story. Oh, right. Anyway. Yes, do go on. Thank you. So, there sat his heart, and it had gotten all wild and hairy just from being out of the chest where it belonged, and away from humanity and emotion. And so, the lady begged him to put it back. Realizing that he needed to do it in order for her to agree to marry him, the warlock took out his wand, opened his chest, and put his heart back. Ew. I warned you beforehand that this story— Yes, I know, Hermione grimaced. Go on. Are you sure? It doesn't get any better. Well, I'm in suspense now. You have to keep going. All right, I sighed. So he put his heart back, but the heart had gotten savage in the meantime, and when the lady threw her arms around the warlock, the heart turned him mad and filled him with murderous and perverse thoughts. Oh, wait, stop. Hermione's arm darted out, and she grabbed me. I froze. My eyes flew to her. She had screwed her eyes shut. Her warm fingers circled my wrist. He kills her, doesn't he? The skin around her shut eyes tightened. I swallowed, trying to form something coherent to say as electricity raced up my arm. Yes, I stammered. Her hand went slack and fell down beside mine. She didn't draw it back. Never mind, she said. I don't need to hear the rest. Well, he comes to a bad end, if that makes you feel any better, I said, halfway recovering. It doesn't. Sorry. It isn't your fault, she said. I asked for it. Yes, you did. She smiled lopsidedly, but her sorrowful gaze still stared upward. I glanced down at our hands, so close together. I bit the inside of my cheek, cursing myself. I'd done it again. And suddenly, I had a new urge, like a seedling breaking through a crack in a concrete. an urge to fix what I'd done. I took a short, bracing breath, and then I slid my hand down and took hold of her fingers. Her head turned and her eyes flashed at me. But I didn't wait. I stood up and pulled her up with me. She stood there, stunned, just for a moment. Then I let go of her and kicked my head toward the willow. Let's see what the door in the ground has for us today, shall we? Hermione's mouth worked, but she couldn't say anything. I grinned and then swept past her, knowing she would follow. She did, and she drew up beside me. I broke into a trot. She did the same, and then we ran as hard as we could, the wind whipping through our clothes and hair. I laughed, and then, like a bell from a church, I heard her laugh in answer. Hermione. Hold it up. No, the point of it, not the hilt. Yeah, wait, no, blast it, Granger. Haven't you ever held a wand? This isn't a wand, it's a sword. I objected as a new blast of wind caught my hair and blew it in my face. The sun, at that slant, lit up the field and Draco with rich, vibrant light and made his blue eyes look more vivid somehow. More like a stick, thank God, or my life would be in danger, Draco said as he stomped toward me through a particularly tall bit of barley, tossed his wooden saber from his right hand to his left, and took hold of my wooden blade. I wasn't sure what the room had been thinking of when it delivered 2 wooden swords to us. Maybe it was my turn to break a bone or fall on my face. Up like this, Draco lifted my blade. Now, turn your shoulders like this. No, like this. He came around me and grabbed my shoulders and turned them. I blushed hard, which was silly, but I couldn't help it. He didn't let go, intent on his instruction. Now, set your stance or I'll be able to push you over. Move this foot out more. He lightly kicked my heel of my right shoe. I did as he said. He came back around in front of me and raised the blade. The intensity in his eyes scared me. I leaned back, wincing. You're not going to hurt me, are you? Of course, Draco answered. If you don't keep that blade up. I quickly jerked the tip of my blade up because I'd let it droop for a second. Now, there are 7 positions of defense, he said. 1, an outside block to the knee. 2, an inside block to the knee. 3, an outside block to the shoulder. 4, an inside block to the shoulder. 5, an outside block above the head. 6, an inside block above the head. 7, a block behind the back. They will counter the strikes I throw to each position. Ready? Relax, Hermione. I'll go slowly. His eyes twinkled dangerously. To begin with. I blinked, then stared. Had he just used my first name? Okay, here's 1, he said, and he swung his sword out to my knee before I had a chance to think about it. Quickly, I put my sword out to block it. Clack! Good! Now, 2. He did the same on the other side. The wood shivered in my hand as I blocked that one as well. I did well, blocking 3, 4, 5, and 6, but 7 gave me a bit of trouble. I had to twist awkwardly as he whirled and almost hit me in the back. I thought you said we were going slowly, I protested. He laughed. If we went any slower, we would melt, he answered, running a hand through his blustering fair hair. Try again. I gritted my teeth and lifted my blade. He came at me again, swinging at exactly the same places as before. I bit my lip and managed to get my sword to each place just an instant before he did. That was faster than before, he said, giving me a bright look. See? You're a quick learner. Let's go again, and once you've got it, I can teach you to do what I'm doing, while I block. I laughed in amazement and shook my head. How do you know all this, Draco? Who taught you? Oh, don't be silly, Draco scoffed. All rich, stuck-up, snobby people who live in manors know how to do useless, sophisticated stuff like this. I burst out laughing, then instantly tried to iron out my expression as he readied his sword. Here we go, he prompted, raising his eyebrow and watching my face. I bit my lip to keep from chuckling and nodding. All right, he swung. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Brilliant, Hermione. Once more. Hermione. Oh, blast. No whinging. I held up a finger. You put yourself in check, remember? I did not. I moved my queen to this square. Exactly, I smirked and lifted my chin. He stared at the chessboard, then gave me a glare. Fine, but you shan't take my king. I won't allow it. I see, I said. And what are you going to do about it? Draco, lying on his side, draped his finger over his chin, studied his greatly diminished black forces, 1 or 2 of which still held key positions that I wasn't worried about. I watched him in the soft blue light, pausing a moment to gaze at his sharp features and fair brow and long eyelashes. I tucked his Slytherin pillow under my chest more comfortably, as it was cushioning me as I lay on my stomach. Draco, slowly reached out his tender hand and moved his last pawn. He let it go. I swiftly took up my queen and slid her right in front of his king. Checkmate. Blast you, Draco cried, flicking his king over. I laughed. I promise I'll let you win tomorrow. You'll do no such thing. He held up a hand, then sat up to grab the blanket near his feet. Patronizing girl, he muttered. I am not patronizing you, I insisted. Yes, you are, he shot back, flopping down onto his ground again. Just because you've beaten me the last 12 times. I set my chin down on the pillow, gazing at the remaining chess pieces. I sighed, thinking. I could still smell his cologne on the pillow. The color must be bad luck, I said. You ought to switch. Bad luck? Never. Draco's blue eyes found mine as he stuffed the white pillow under his head. Old family name, you know. Can't turn my back on that. Black? I frowned. Really? He glanced at me, then nodded once. My mother's maiden name was Black. I was stunned. Then, serious? I stammered, trying to form a coherent sentence. Draco went still, then raised up to prop himself on his elbow. He lifted his eyebrows and took his black king and turned it over in his hand. Yes, my mother and my grandfather were brother and sister. So he's a cousin of sorts. Or he was, I managed, but suddenly feeling a pain in my throat. Draco was still a moment. Then he nodded. Yes, my mother's cousin. I never thought of it, I said, going cold. All of my muscles went tight, and I slowly canted my head and looked at him. Was it difficult for you when he... I never knew him. Draco tossed his piece down on the board. It clattered. I flopped down onto his back and stared up at the top of the trees. He took a deep breath and swallowed. Perhaps I will switch. Tears pricked my eyes. I took a breath to try to speak, but my chest shivered. I stopped myself, then steadied my voice. Black isn't all bad, I whispered. He glanced at me, then gave half a smile. Didn't answer. Then he returned to gazing at the high boughs. I could tell, though, that he was quite awake now, thinking of what I had said. I picked up his black knight and fingered with it, then took another breath. Roses whisper good night, 'neath silvery light. Asleep in the dew, they hide from our view. When the dawn peepeth through, God will wake them in you. When the dawn peepeth through, God will wake them in you. I watched the little golden light, slower and more careful than usual, drift up and settle on his chest. He didn't look at them, as I thought he would. His eyes fluttered, and the tension in his jaw released. I quieted my voice, but I kept going. Slumber sweetly, dear, for the angels are near, to watch over you the silent night through, and to bear you above to the dreamland of love, and to bear you above to the dreamland of love. He was asleep. It had happened in a single moment. I watched the golden light sink in, and then he sighed and faded down. And I clamped a hand over my mouth and fought inexplicable tears. Sirius Black had been Draco's family. That great noble man who had died for all of us shared the same blood as Draco Malfoy. Yet he'd never known him. He'd been deprived of the company of one of the brightest souls I'd ever known. And yet, somehow, a shred of that brilliance had gotten passed through the line. 3 days ago, I would have laughed at the thought, but right now, as I lay there gazing at Draco, swiping at my eyes, I believed it. Draco had transformed. I had no idea what had happened to him during that storm, but one look into his eyes had told me that I couldn't bear to ask. Experiences mark people's faces. I knew that well enough to recognize the scars. Scars made by emotional wounds, not physical. And ultimate pain, ultimate suffering, leaves a special mark. I see that on Harry's face, on Lupin's, even Professor Snape's, if I were to be honest with myself. And that morning after the storm, as I had sat there in the sunrise and glanced over at Draco Malfoy, I had seen it in his face, written right across his stunning blue eyes, and I dared not ask why. Not yet. Soon. I turned onto my side, lying down parallel to him, with the chessboard between us, and rested my head on his pillow. I faced him as I curled up in a ball, holding the knight in both hands. The angels are near, I whispered, tightening my hold on that knight, to watch over you, the silent night through.